This is the story of the Mount Erebus disaster. Antarctica is a place that has not been explored that much, and maybe that's why so many people are so fascinated with it. On the 28th of November 1979, 237 such people boarded an Air New Zealand DC-10 in Auckland to see the sights of Antarctica. Flight 901 was a sightseeing flight designed to give passengers a beautiful view of the continent. The flight even featured a guide who would provide commentary on everything that they saw out of their windows. In fact, Sir Edmund Hillary was supposed to be a guide on this flight, but he had to cancel and a friend took his place. As routine as this flight felt, this flight came with a few unique challenges of its own. The DC-10 had to carry a lot of fuel. If something went wrong, they wouldn't have a lot of airports to divert to, if there were any available, that is. On the 28th, they were planning to fly through the McMurdo Sound, which would give the passengers a great view of Antarctica. After departing Auckland, Flight 901 approached Antarctica. The US Navy provided air traffic control services in this part of the world, and that's who the pilots were in contact with. ATC gave Flight 901 permission to descend to 1,500 feet. Usually, the minimum altitude here was 6,000 feet, but ATC let planes fly a lot lower if the weather was good. ATC was fine with this as long as they were flying over flat terrain or open water, so 1,500 feet was a perfectly safe altitude to be at. As they approached McMurdo Sound, clouds were low at 3,000 feet, and the pilots had some trouble communicating with ATC, but it wasn't too bad. The pilots talked with ATC. They worked out a system where the plane would descend down to 1,500 feet with radar assistance. After that, they'd be in visual conditions and they'd be able to navigate on their own. With the weather ahead being not so ideal, the crew decided to descend in a clear area. They put their DC-10 into a series of orbits as the plane descended. Throughout their descent, the pilots kept checking in with ATC, letting them know of the conditions that they were in. For example, at 6,000 feet, they were still in the clouds. Unknown to the controllers, that would be the last time they'd hear from Flight 901. In the cockpit, they had leveled the DC-10 and things appeared to be going quite well, when suddenly the ground proximity warning system activated, asking the pilots to pull up. The flight engineer said 500 feet, signifying that they were 500 feet above terrain. The captain immediately commanded go-around power, but before the engines could spool up to max power, the ground rose up from underneath them. The DC-10 flew into the side of Mount Erebus, a mountain in Antarctica. At the control tower at McMurdo Sound, the minutes ticked by. They waited for contact to be re-established with Flight 901. At first, they assumed that Flight 901 had diverted to Lake Victoria because the weather was better there. The controllers then tried hailing the plane on different frequencies, but they got no reply. They even tried to get other planes to contact Flight 901. Still, no reply. By 2 p.m., the plane had been radio silent for an hour, and search and rescue airplanes were put on standby. Many hours later, the wreck of Flight 901 was found on the northern slopes of Mount Erebus at 1,500 feet by a United States Navy search aircraft. None of the 257 people on board survived. The final report of the investigation into crash Flight 901 cited pilot error as the cause. The pilots flew too low and accidentally flew their plane into a mountain. Case closed, right? But this led to public outcry. As we talked about before, the minimum altitude in the area was 6,000 feet. Obviously, the pilots went way below that. So why the outcry? Yes, the pilots did go below the minimum safe altitude, but they were expected to do that. Air New Zealand's own marketing material for this flight showed amazing photographs of the Antarctic, photographs that were taken well below 6,000 feet in altitude. Other people who had been on similar flights had testified to the fact that planes routinely breached that 6,000 feet minimum safe altitude limit on these sightseeing flights. You can't really blame pilots for doing something that they were expected to do, can you? Many people thought as much, and due to mounting pressure, the government decided to start another inquiry into the crash, this time headed by Justice Peter Mallon. The first investigation had assumed that the plane was flying in a cloud when it impacted the mountain, but Peter had proved that that wasn't the case. This was first and foremost a sightseeing trip, so unlike other flights, there were people constantly taking pictures. The pictures that were taken right before the impact clearly showed that they weren't in a cloudy environment. You could see ice sheets and mountains in the distance. The site of the crash also raised a few eyebrows. They flew into the side of Mount Erebus, but the crew were briefed on a flight path that took them nowhere near that mountain. They were supposed to have 27 miles between their flight path and the mountain itself. So how did Flight 901 end up at the mountain? To understand this, they needed to look at the data that the pilots used to program the plane's computers. The plane uses waypoints to navigate, a series of coordinates that it flies to. For the accident flight, the second last waypoint was Cape Hallett, about 337 miles away from their final waypoint/destination of McMurdo Station. For most of the flight, the computer was flying the plane from waypoint to waypoint, except for when the pilots did the orbits to descend down to 1,500 feet. But other than that, the plane was on autopilot, flying what the pilots had punched into their computer. So, the sobering truth is that the pilots had essentially programmed the plane to overfly the mountain, and then they descended below the minimum safe altitude to give the passengers a better view of what's outside. But this makes no sense. Why would the pilots descend and then tell the plane to fly itself towards a mountain if they knew that their flight path took them right over a mountain? Here's the thing, they didn't know that they'd be anywhere near Mount Erebus. As we mentioned before, they were expecting to fly through the McMurdo Sound, over open water and flat terrain. That's why the pilots engaged the nav mode after the orbits. In their minds, they were well clear of any obstacles. Now, where did the pilots get that idea? Why didn't they know that they were headed right for a mountain? 19 days before the crash, on the 28th of November, the captain and the first officer attended a briefing for the sightseeing flight. They were joined by other pilots who had flown this route before and had access to maps and waypoints that they'd need to navigate. The captain, being a good pilot, went home and plotted the flight path to see where the coordinates would take him, and the track that he came up with clearly showed that the plane would go down the McMurdo Sound, far away from mountains or obstacles. On the day of the accident, the crew were handed the waypoints for the flight, but unknown to the crew, the waypoints had been changed. It's a small change, but it changed the flight path entirely. With the changed waypoint, the flight path that they inputted took them directly over Mount Erebus. On that fateful day, when they took off, they expected to fly over open water, but they didn't know that the coordinates that they had entered would take them right into a mountain. So how did the waypoint get changed? And more importantly, why didn't someone just say, hey, we've tweaked the waypoints a bit? Why were the pilots in the dark? To find the answer to that, we need to go back years. In 1977, the whole flight planning thing was a manual operation. In 1978, they decided to computerize the whole process. A computer would hold all flight plans that Air New Zealand needed, and as and when they were required, they were printed out and given to the flight crews. That's a simplified explanation of what happened, but you get the gist of it. During this computerization process, someone needed to manually enter waypoints into the computer. When it came to enter the coordinates for the McMurdo waypoint, the waypoint that they wanted to enter was the coordinates of an NDB beacon in McMurdo, which had the coordinates 77 degrees 51 minutes south and 166 degrees and 41 minutes east. This NDB was important. This is what they navigated to. But a typing error was made when someone mistakenly entered the coordinates of the Williams Field waypoint, a waypoint that wasn't used anymore. This one had the longitude of 166 degrees and 48 minutes east. That meant that the final waypoint was a few miles away from where it should be. Before Flight 901 took off, someone had corrected this error, and the pilots were never told. That meant that the flight path over the mountain was the planned path all along, and for months, planes had been flying through the McMurdo Sound over the water as a result of this error. This rabbit hole of an investigation has one more twist. Why did the coordinate mistake that had gone unnoticed for months and months suddenly get fixed. A few days before Flight 901 even took to the skies, another sightseeing flight, captained by a Leslie Simpson, was going over the waypoints for the flight. He assumed that the waypoint that he had been given and the McMurdo waypoint would be close by, but when he plotted both points on a map, he was surprised to find a large gap between the 2 points because of this error. When he landed back, he talked to Air New Zealand's navigational department about the discrepancy. For some reason, the navigational department changed the final waypoint to correspond to a tactical air navigational beacon near the McMurdo NDB. This is the waypoint that was given to the flight crew. Just to recap, years ago, a digitization mistake with the final waypoint meant that the final waypoint was far away from where it should have been. This error was not caught immediately, and so for months on end, Air New Zealand conducted flights using the incorrect waypoint. This meant that planes flew down the McMurdo Sound instead of overflying Mount Erebus. Then one captain noticed the mistake, and the navigational team just changed the waypoint to the place where it should have been, which put Mount Erebus right in the plane's path. But that doesn't explain everything. Remember how the plane was in clear weather when it crashed? If the passengers could see out the windows, then why couldn't the pilot see the mountain that was right in front of them? They fell victim to a phenomenon known as whiteout. The only reason we're able to distinguish objects is because of contrast. If you have a white pillow on a white sheet, it tends to blend into the sheet. In the same way, the white mountain tends to blend into the white clouds behind it, making it very hard to see the mountain, even if you're looking at it head on. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around it, but it's a real phenomenon. If you're not very experienced, you can definitely fall for this. And that's how a passenger jet flew into the side of a mountain. The story of Flight 901 lives on to this day because of how much this shook New Zealand. In this video, I just dove into the technical aspects of things. I haven't even touched on the political aspects of things because frankly, I don't understand it too well. But something else was at play here. Remember how the captain kept maps and stuff of his own? Well, after the crash, the captain's house was broken into and a bunch of the captain's documents went missing. Even more suspiciously, right after the crash, people at the airline started shredding documents. It appeared that some people knew the true cause of the crash right from day one, and they tried to cover it up. But Justice Mahon uncovered the truth. He ended up referring to what happened as an orchestrated litany of lies. That phrase caught on like wildfire. But the long and short of it is that there was an attempt to blame innocent pilots for this disaster. Had it not been for Justice Mahon's work, their legacies would be very different today. The fact of the matter is that Captain Jim Collins, First Officer Greg Casson, and Flight Engineer Gordon Brooks did nothing wrong. When the warnings came on, they acted as fast as they could, but it just wasn't enough. If you want to do a deep dive on this accident, I highly recommend RNZ's White Silence podcast. It's about 8 episodes long, and it takes a deep look into the political aspects of the crash. If you were around when this happened, what was it like? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.